The walking that day had been all climbs and descents. It was a pleasure now to amble through flat pasture beside the chattering river. The clouds seemed to be thinning, and Anne felt warm after being immersed in the cold water. The strangled-sounding croaks of cock pheasants came from clumps of bilberry and heather edging the pasture. From time to time, the birds' plump copper bodies could be seen scurrying from one patch of cover to another. "Only a week till the shooting season starts," Jim said. "I didn't know you shot," said Anne. "I don't much," Jim said. "What do you shoot? Not animals, right?" Jim paused and looked at her. "No," he said. "Would you shoot an animal?" He looked away. "No," he said. He was lying. She knew he was lying. Several times in the weeks since she met him, Anne had thought Jim was telling her what she wanted to hear. Even before she agreed to this weekend away, the trait had been irritating her. Now she regretted having come. She had wanted to sleep with him as soon as she saw him, leaning against the kitchen counter at a party in a big, dilapidated house in Chalk Farm. And she had slept with him, but now she wished she had left it at that. The sky continued to lighten. Wisps of cloud blew across a moon-white sun. A walking trip had been Jim's idea, and Anne had loved the thought of exploring a landscape, but she saw now that for him the pleasure lay in reaching a goal, 12 miles in a day, tick, while she was more interested in seeing things she might otherwise not. Earlier in the day, having established that Jim didn't know the names of most trees and flowers, she had tried to teach him some as they walked: hazel, alder, balsam. But it soon became clear he wasn't interested. Now she did it obstinately, pointing to a clump of clover-like leaves beside a kissing gate. "Wood sorrel," she said. Jim barely looked where she had pointed. He pushed the gate open for her. Earlier in the day they had made an event of these gates, puckering their lips exaggeratedly. On a quiet woodland path just before the climb up to Hawkridge, their kiss had developed into something more serious as they passed through the gate. She was here anyway, she thought, and he was sexy, even if he was annoying. Anne had backed against a tree, tugging Jim after her. She was gripping his erection through his trousers when she heard the clinking of camping gear, and they were still arranging themselves when a pair of older, silver-haired walkers strode past, packs swaying. Breezily they said hello, then fell laughing against each other after the strangers had passed. Now, angry at the lie, Anne still lifted her face as they passed through the gate, but kept her mouth closed against the thrust of Jim's tongue. She made a joke of it. "Wait till we're in Withypool," she said, swatting his chest. "Ah, Withypool," Jim said with mock awe. "The Paris of Somerset." They continued moving upriver. The rushing water flashed blackly beside them. Jim was looking at something as they passed, and Anne turned to see a short metal ladder and a small cage affixed to the side of an oak. "For hunting," she said. "Guess so," he said. Anne shook her head. Looking away towards the water, she saw an uneven path of stepping stones running across the river. They stood from its surface like the vertebrae of a giant animal. "Look," she said. She reached into the thigh pocket of Jim's combat trousers for the map. She spread the map on the ground and traced her finger across it. Withypool lay on the other side of a steep ridge. "If we cut across," she said, "we'll avoid the climb completely." Jim crouched down beside the river, his back to Anne. "Jim, what do you think? It knocks about a mile off. We could be in Withypool in less than half an hour." He still didn't answer. Anne stood and walked over to him. The river was deeper here and running fast. The large, irregularly shaped stones standing proud of the water were a mottled grey, their corners furred with dark green moss. The ones that sat lower in the flow were black and glossy, like a killer whale's skin. An arrow of sun pierced the cloud and struck the running water, sending sparks skidding over its surface. It turned the foam fringing the stones gold, and for a moment the water became too brilliant to look at. It roared like a crowd in Anne's ears. Jim stood. "Well?" Anne said, shrugging. "Man or mouse?" Jim smiled at her and looked away. "Nah," he said. "Let's stick to the plan. Really? Said Anne. She kept her voice light, but disappointment yawned in her. Could be fun, she said. Yeah, Jim sounded unconvinced. I think we had our fun for the day back there. It looks easy, I know, but the water's deeper here. One slip and it's goodbye dry gear. Tomorrow'd be a joke in wet clothes. He picked up the map and folded it away as he started walking, then turned around and took a few steps backwards. Come on, he said. Guinness on me when we get there. Anne forced a smile and gave him a thumbs up. She looked from one stepping stone to the next, to a cluster of white flowers nodding just above the water on the far bank. 17 stones. She threw a handful of plucked grass into the current and watched as the blades were snatched rapidly away. Jim was already a good distance ahead, ascending the ridge. Above him, a group of sheep moved away at his approach. Keep going, you arsehole, Anne thought. She climbed after him. She wanted to be on her own, but didn't know how Jim would react if she crossed the river without him. She couldn't be bothered dealing with his anger, or worse, his sulking. At the top of the field, she turned just as the sun broke out again. The river ran white with light. She saw herself halfway across it, jumping from stone to stone towards the bright, empty fields beyond. The path climbed into a wood. Anne stepped up old stone steps with risers more than a foot tall. Rivulets streaked the steep hillside. Some of them held no more than a trickle, while in others the water gushed down to join the river that now lay far below. Anne couldn't see Jim, but she could smell his acrid tobacco smoke. She swatted the air and rubbed her eyes. She felt tired and angry with herself for being here at all. Why did she always prolong things when she knew they weren't going to work? She fought an urge to stop walking and lie down beside the path. She passed another field of sheep, their coats marked with sprays of blue dye. Most of them were shambling away from the fence, Jim's living wake. Only one sheep stood its ground, a black-faced animal that held Anne's gaze as she passed, its jaw working on a hank of grass. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sheep," she called, saluting the way her mum had taught her to greet magpies. The sheep blinked, and its tail flickered from side to side as it pushed a sequence of turds onto the ground behind it. Anne found Jim further uphill, idly whacking a bush with a stick. The climb became a descent, and before long they stepped off the earth track onto the tarmac of the Withypool Road. Ferns covered the high banks on either side, and branches of oak and beech joined to form a tunnel. Soon they were passing stone cottages and barns, the only signs of life the threads of smoke rising from chimneys. They had booked a room at the Willow Tree, whose custard yellow walls and blue windows reminded Anne of a witch's gingerbread house. She eased herself gratefully onto the bench of a trestle table that stood on a flagstone terrace above the road. The only other people drinking outdoors were a man and woman with a pair of velvet brown pointers lying at their feet. The dogs stayed down, but their eyes rebounded from Jim to Anne to their owners. The owners nodded hello and continued their conversation in low voices. "Drink," Jim said. "Oh God, yes," said Anne, smiling. "Guinness, pint, please." Jim went inside the pub. Anne took off her boots and stretched her legs. They had walked more than 10 miles of hilly ground that day, and now she was sitting down, she felt like she might never stand up. Her legs were packed with wet sand. The dogs regarded her, their sides swelling and shrinking in unison. Looking up from them, she found the man staring at her. The woman, her back to Anne, was hunting through her bag for something. The man took a sip from his pint, his eyes never leaving Anne's. She knew what that look wanted. He was rangy, strong-looking in brown barber and muddy jeans. His sharp jaw was mossed with a couple of days' growth of beard. His eyes were dark, unblinking. Then the woman produced a lighter from her bag, and the man turned towards her and pushed a pack of cigarettes across the table. Jim returned with 2 black pints. The stout was cold and thick, and Anne drank deeply, the beer's creamy head forming a moustache that spread from her nostrils to her cheeks. Jim laughed and tipped his glass so far back that he coated his nose, and rivulets brown as river water streaked across his cheeks to his ears. Now Anne laughed. The dog owners looked on in silence. Screw yourselves, Anne thought, thinking she might as well enjoy herself, even as it all collapsed. She raised her pint in another toast. They clashed glasses and gulped down the cold black beer.